Try to do these on Wednesday mornings, Eastern time. Today, I want to talk a little bit about some of my experiences working with folks over the years with mental health. So, I started working in healthcare settings back in 1995. I've been in that world for many, many years, and then I've worked in other settings through, over the years, like intensive outpatient, partial hospitalization programs. Anyway, I thought I would tell you a couple of stories. A lot of people know me for working for yoga for better mental health. And over the years, I've had two people ask me if I would be their therapist. And, I've usually said, why would you want me to be your, not yoga therapist, like psychotherapist, right? And usually, I like motivational interviewing a lot, which is where you just ask lots of questions. So I would be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why do you think that's a good idea? And then it would usually the answers were something like, well, because I get more out of yoga than I do out of my psychotherapy. And so could you be my therapist? And so when that happens, like I try hard not to be like, or whatever. And I usually say, like, I know some really good therapists that I could recommend you to, but the thing is, like, I'm not a psychotherapist, so I can't be your therapist. I mean, I could do yoga therapy with you, but I can't do therapy with you. And that like making that boundary is for some people they feel rejected, so you have to be really careful doing it because people look up, you're a yoga teacher, and people are like, oh, she seems so relaxed or whatever, which, like, they don't know me very well, but there's that kind of projection. Like, of course people are going to project stuff onto you. They project good stuff onto you, and they project really bad stuff onto you too. So you have to go with the flow. So I've always felt like really honored when people ask me that, I'll say it that way, like, please don't think that I'm rejecting you at all. I just can't, because it's not my scope of practice. One time I had, well, actually, this has happened another two times. I've had, gosh, it's much more than two times, but two extreme times. I've worked with women with severe, severe eating disorders, and same thing. Like, I don't need a therapist because I do yoga, and that is something that I've actually had to put a hard boundary down with twice. That's, I've worked with tons of people with eating disorders, but I've had to put a hard boundary down twice and say, I'm sorry, but I can't work with you. I really don't want you to even come to my class until you're under care. And the reason is because I don't want anyone to die, thinking, or not even die. Like, I don't want them to get hurt, let alone when you're dealing with severe cases of eating disorders or severe alcoholism or severe anything, um, severe and persistent mental illness, like, the last thing I want to do is to give anybody the idea that yoga is a solution to scope of practice, to their problem, and it because it's out of scope of practice, right? So that being said, that doesn't mean that yoga can't help. So when folks come to me and say, I'm using yoga for depression, or I'm using yoga for my anxiety because my therapist told me to, or my psychiatrist told me to, then I'm like, cool, awesome. Like, I love to work with you because you've got somebody who's really making sure you're safe, that then can work with you, because we've had a huge shift, a huge rise in the number of cases of depression since COVID, a huge rise, and especially amongst younger people, and also another huge rise in the number of cases of anxiety, like specific generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, like things that you can specifically pin a diagnosis on. We've had a huge rise in those things. There's plenty of data out there from the Lancet, from the CDC. The people are tracking it, and that means, and by the way, the therapist, I know, and just like the rest of the healthcare system is highly, they are highly exhausted and overworked for the most part. So people are going to come to yoga, which is fantastic, but we have to be really careful. So I just wanted to give you some of that experience that I've had with folks, and how you can't take that on. You just can't as a yoga professional. It's not okay. And it's not okay for you. It's not okay for your clients. It's not okay for the profession. And at the same time, like when people say, "Oh, I'm coming to yoga because my therapist told me to," I'm like, "Yes, like, I love your therapist." Okay, so now I want to give you, before I just wanted to start with that story, but now what I want to give you is a couple of tips about teaching, because some things not to do when you're teaching, right? A lot of times people will come to yoga and say, "I'm really anxious. I have a," they may not say that, but they'll present that way. And sometimes they will tell you, "I'm super anxious. And the only thing that helps is vinyasa. The only thing that helps is hot yoga." That's not what I teach. Right? I don't teach that stuff. So I tell people, like, "Okay, you heard that I was the yoga teacher to work with for mental health stuff or for anxiety or whatever, but I'm going to teach you something different." So what I'm not going to do with folks who come to me with anxiety is say, "Please lie down in restorative yoga," or "Put your legs up the wall," or "Put your legs up a chair," or "Do this yin practice," or whatever, because that's a good way to make them hate yoga forever. So what I would rather do is use some stronger poses and some specific breathing adaptations. Because when you can give them specific breathing patterns that help them to shift with the asana, I'm not just saying, like, "Do this breath," because that often makes people more anxious, but I'm going to move them and do some breath at the same time, kind of sneak the breath in there. Like, that often is a really good way to start a practice to help folks with anxiety. And I learned that over the years. I mean, of course, I've learned that from my training, the way that I've been trained, but I've also learned it over the years from working with hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And one of the things I used to see all the time, and I didn't understand, was folks coming to my classes and being like, "I hate your class because it doesn't do anything for me." I mean, they wouldn't say that, but you know what I mean? Like, "I never come back to your class," or, "Yeah, I need to do that class because I get sweaty and it feels better." And it took me a long time to understand and to study and to realize the nature of that complaint was not that they were not understanding the value of yoga. It's just the anxiety in their body was keeping them from being able to access these deeper, more meditative practices. And I had to learn how to work with that. So that's my first tip, working with anxiety. And then number two is going to be working with depression, because the same principle applies. Don't think you're going to take somebody who has depression and go, "Okay, now we're going to do sun salutations. That'll fix your depression," because I've worked with people with serious depression over the years, with major depressive disorder over the years, that getting out of their bed was hard. So if somebody has dragged themselves to yoga class and they're depressed and they have depression or fatigue issues, the last thing you do is ask them to do a bunch of sun salutations, right? In that case, what you want to do is start with very slow, mindful, relaxing movements. And that might be all you do for a while, depending on how you're working. Like, if you're working with a class that's specifically like, "Okay, this class is for people with fatigue challenges," because if you put out a class, "Yoga for Depression," nobody's going to come. Right, they're already depressed. They already know that they have depression, and the last thing they need to do is get that label on their head, right? So you might want to call it the same thing with anxiety, but anxiety is a little different because the yoga world is full of anxious people, because everybody's hypermobile. Not everybody, many people are hypermobile, and hypermobility and anxiety go together, right? But with depression, if you're talking about like low energy, fatigue, chronic fatigue, like those things tend to be things that people with depression will do. But you say like yoga for depression, it's like yoga for alcoholism or something, or yoga for addiction. Like, that label on the forehead is already so agonizing that why would you want to label that in a yoga class? Why would you want to go? Unless it's happening in a treatment setting, of course, right? So low energy, like, this class is for people with low energy. It's so much more inviting. And when you ask people with low energy to come to the class, you don't want to give them a pot of coffee yoga practice. Like a stimulating or a ton of different hyperventilating practice. Like, no, you meet the mood. So folks who are struggling with depression and low energy often need very small, mindful movement, relax, relax, relax. One of the strongest correlations we have for folks that actually get those diagnoses with major depression disorder is burnout. So 4 or 5, the research shows 4 or 5 very stressful events in a person's life often precede the major depressive uh, diagnosis, right? So that means that people are exhausted. Their nervous system is burned out. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is burned out. And what we need to give them is something that's so soothing for their soul, like a little gentle self massage, slow movements, lots of lovely, nurturing breath. That's what's going to help folks with who are struggling with depression to slowly build their energy. So the thing to remember is meet the mood when you're working with low energy or high energy. Meet the mood, take it in the direction that it needs to go. So I hope that's helpful. If you want more tips and actually a deeper dive into this whole topic, feel free to join me this Saturday and Sunday. We still have spaces available. It's a live workshop online called Teaching the Neuroscience of Yoga for Anxiety and Depression. Love you to join me for that. I will put a link, if there's a link in the description, but I'll put another link here on my Instagram feed. So thank you for being here. I'll see you next week. Take care. Lots of love.